Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where the White House is cracking down on what it deems the radical left and moving to retaliate against some of its most outspoken critics in the wake of the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. The White House has publicly called for consequences and firings of anyone whose comments are seen as endorsing Kirk's death. And administration officials are cheering the indefinite suspension of ABC's Jimmy Kimmel in the wake of comments the late-night talk show host made in his monologue Monday night. Here they are.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it.
Kimmel's suspension drawing outrage from Democrats, Hollywood stars, and labor unions representing writers and actors who are decrying the move as a violation of free speech. ABC's decision came hours after Nexstar, which owns more than 30 ABC affiliates nationwide, announced that it would preempt Jimmy Kimmel Live on its stations in light of the host's remarks. And as President Trump's FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr issued threats against the ABC affiliates.
You know, when you look at the conduct that has taken place by Jimmy Kimmel, it appears to be some of the sickest conduct possible. Frankly, when you see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, you know, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
We at the FCC are going to enforce the public interest obligation. If there's broadcasters out there that don't like it, they can turn their license into the FCC. But that's our job. And again, we're making some progress now.
This morning, Carr suggesting that Kimmel's suspension was a business decision by ABC's parent company, Disney, while also warning that there could be additional fallout.
Our goal and our obligation here is to make sure that broadcasters are serving the public interest. And if there's local TV stations that don't think that running that programming does it, then they have every right under the law in their contracts to preempt it. And we'll see how this plays out. But I do think that, again, we're in the midst of a massive shift in dynamics in the media ecosystem for lots of reasons, again, including the permission structure that President Trump's election has provided. And I would simply say we're not done yet with seeing the consequences of that.
The president this afternoon on Air Force One suggesting he could pull broadcast licenses from networks who are critical of him.
I read someplace that the networks were 97% against me. I get 97% negative, and yet I won it easily. I won all 7 swing states, popular, I won everything. And if they're 97% against, they give me only bad publicity or press. I mean, they're getting a license. I would think maybe their license should be taken away. It will be up to Brendan Carr.
The president, meanwhile, also announcing on social media that he was designating Antifa, a loosely affiliated group of anti-fascism activists, as a major terrorist organization. That comes as a source tells NBC News that the Trump administration is planning actions against certain liberal organizations it accuses of contributing to political unrest and violence against the right. Vice President J.D. Vance issuing this warning last night.
That is not a both sides problem. My friend is dead because of left-wing political radicalization. And if you want to cut that out, then be honest about it and look yourself in the mirror. We are working very hard to ensure that the funding networks for left-wing violence, that the radicalization networks for left-wing violence, that if you encourage or fund your fellow Americans or anybody else to commit acts of violence because you disagree with political speech, you are going to be treated like a terrorist organization, and we're going to go after you.
The White House's vow to avenge Charlie Kirk's death by going after democratically aligned groups and critics is the latest example of the administration pushing the limits of President Trump's executive authority while also raising serious questions about free speech and censorship in this incredibly volatile moment in American politics. Joining me now to discuss this, NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hillyard, NBC News Justice reporter Reilly, and Washington University Law School professor and National Constitution Center president and CEO Jeffrey Rosen. Thanks to all of you for starting us off. Vaughn, let me start with you. What more are you hearing from the president and the White House about the Kimmel suspension?
Right. The president on that same aircraft ride here back to the United States, he said that the evening shows, all they do is hit Trump. Quote, they're not allowed to do that. This comes down to just what exactly does the FCC under Chair Brendan Carr intend to do? Because so far, most of these actions here by the networks or the broadcast licensees have been made through sort of unforced obedience, if you will. In this scenario, you had Nexstar, which has a $6 billion acquisition of Tegna, another major broadcast television licensee, on the line, in which they need FCC approval. It kind of mirrors what took place back in July when the CBS, it settled a lawsuit with President Trump. Days later, CBS canceled the Colbert Show, and just about 10 days after that is when the FCC under Brendan Carr approved the merger between Skydance and Paramount, a seismic merger. And so this really calls into question here, as you heard from Brendan Carr, is what other steps do others take here? Because the FCC has already launched an investigation into other news network entities here. And so for Brendan Carr, he has made clear what the mission is, but it's a question of whether they will seek to actually impose fines or revoke licenses, which would require a long FCC and then legal process after that in order to actually revoke any licenses of entities that they believe have been not using their licenses in the public interest.
And Vaughn, take me inside your conversations with your sources. Do you have a sense of whether FCC Chair Carr was acting on his own when he made that threat to ABC affiliates, or was it in conjunction or at the direction of the White House?
We know that Brendan Carr is somebody who was first appointed by President Trump to this FCC post. And we know from conversations dating back into 2023, when Brendan Carr was the author of the chapter on the FCC and Project 2025, that this was somebody who the administration was going to heavily rely on to take actions against networks and media outlets that it perceived to not be providing fair TV coverage. And the president on Air Force One was just asked about Brendan Carr, and he said that it would be up to him effectively who they intend to revoke the licenses of. And so there is a level of affirmation and a level of acknowledgement of the actions within the FCC, which is supposed to be an independent agency that we haven't seen act sort of in this political regard dating back to the early 70s when Katharine Graham at the Washington Post at the time had broadcast licensees down in Florida for several local TV stations, and the Nixon administration attempted to, or threatened, I should say, the Katharine Graham to take away those licenses as they broadcast Watergate reporting coming from the Washington Post. So really this is unprecedented dating back to the early 70s. And so for in many ways here, this is a White House that is getting exactly what it wanted. And there are serious questions for others in the broadcast network entities that are trying to seek either acquisitions or mergers ahead about whether the FCC will be willing to approve, understanding that the votes of these FCC members that have been appointed by Trump are going to be imperative to ultimately them getting through what their intended business acquisitions or deals are.
All right, Vaughn Hillyard from the White House, thank you so much for your great reporting. As always, I do want to turn to Ryan Reilly, who joins me here on set. Ryan, can you break down for us what exactly is Antifa and what would this terrorist designation actually mean in practical terms?
Yeah, well, as Trump's former FBI director, Christopher Wray, said, it's more of an idea than an organization, right? This is not a really well-organized top-bottom, just by virtue of being an anti-fascist organization, they sort of don't like the idea of a hierarchy, right? So it's not as though they're electing leaders and have due-paying members and whatnot, and they're just very. There's basic principles to of what they do. Obviously, the black clothing is a major thing, but in terms of the designation. Well, I spoke with Mary McCord, who's the former head of the Justice Department's National Security Division, and it's essentially meaningless. There's this
so it's symbolic.
It's
basically.
symbolic, right?
Yeah.
Like he can say that, but there's no law attached to it. For acts of domestic terrorism, if there's a federal conviction, what happens on the back end is you can seek a sentencing enhancement, but there's not a standalone charge of domestic terrorism. Charlie Kirk's assassination, for example. vaguely fits the definition of an act of domestic terrorism, but it's difficult for federal prosecutors to find a charge to charge that with. They're exploring it, but you have to be a little bit creative with federal law to find a way in.
So, Ryan, what exactly would the consequences be of this designation if it is, in fact, more symbolic than anything else?
I think that, we did this the first time around, right? They did this Antifa designation. Yeah. Again, I was going back, I was like, oh, I wrote a story about this 5 years ago, right? And during that time, William Barr and the FBI turned a lot of attention towards these Antifa organizations, and they didn't really come up with much because there's not that much organizing really going on. It's not like a Proud Boys type of organization. It's not like these other types of organizations. They kind of just coalesce around certain, areas, and it's just not like a membership-based organization. It's just more, and there's a lot of different kinds of people within that coalition. It's anti-fascist, right? So it's like they're against government overreach, government power. That's not the type of organization that has this very specific ideological movement like you see from a Proud Boys, when they stormed the Capitol, for example.
Yeah. All right. Ryan Reilly, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your insights. We really appreciate it. Jeffrey Rosen, let me turn to you. You are an expert in constitutional law. The ACLU put out a statement in reaction to Kimmel's suspension, saying that this moment represents a, quote, grave threat to our First Amendment freedoms. What are your thoughts today?
The networks are private companies, and in some sense, they can have on whoever they want. However, there is a Supreme Court precedent saying that the government cannot pressure private companies to punish individuals because of their speech. And there are two cases in particular that were decided in 2024 that suggest that Kimmel possibly could have a Supreme Court case if he could establish that ABC was acting in response to the government's threats. In particular, the court held in a case called Vulo that New York couldn't pressure insurance companies not to do business with the National Rifle Association because that was punishing the NRA because of their speech. And there was a second case called Murtha that held that the Biden administration couldn't jawbone or pressure social media companies to take down COVID speech that they called misinformation. So with those two cases, the head of the FCC got up and said that we're going to do something about Kimmel's speech. And if Kimmel could prove that ABC acted in response to the FCC's threats under those two Supreme Court cases, he might actually have a claim.
Well, I guess the question is, where is the line drawn? That line between, look, this is a private company versus you're violating someone's First Amendment rights.
Exactly. And it's a very hard line to draw. Even in that case involving social media companies, the Supreme Court said, well, it's not clear that the media companies were really acting in response to Biden's threats. If they were acting on their own, they're allowed to do that. And here we had the head of ABC say this was a purely business decision. So ABC is going to claim they were not acting in response to government threats. And in fact, the timing of the threat suggests that it may have come even after the firing. So these are not easy to prove factually, but just let's remember the basic principle in America. The government can't punish people because of their speech, because of criticisms of the government. That goes back to just after the American Constitution was drafted and the Adams administration passed a sedition law, making it a crime to criticize the president. And Thomas Jefferson said that's unconstitutional, and about a century later, the Supreme Court agreed. So that's the backdrop of all this. Proving it in practice before a court might be difficult, but that's why it's such an extremely serious time for free speech in America.
So could this potentially be the start of a slippery slope when it comes to the government censoring what people can and cannot say? Right now, there's a Republican in the White House. At some point, there's going to be a Democrat in the White House. What's to say that the Democratic president won't take action against conservative hosts?
That's exactly the fear. And that's why a bedrock principle of our First Amendment is that the government cannot punish people because of their speech. It's complicated in a media age where speech platforms are controlled by private companies and they have business interests that are separate from these free speech interests. But the fear is that the government could indeed, by pressuring private companies to fire its critics, do exactly what the framers of the Constitution hoped that they would not do.
What are you going to be watching for moving forward, specifically with this Jimmy Kimmel case, but more broadly, as the administration says they may take action against liberal organizations?
I'll be looking to see whether organizations, liberal, conservative, or just media organizations, because that's really what we're talking about now, whether any of them stand up behind their reporters and the people who are appearing and back them up rather than firing them. Some of the newspapers have tried to do that. President Trump has sued the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Both of them have refused to back down. By contrast, law firms have tended to make deals with President Trump. But when it comes to the media, it's a very important question, and the ultimate decision is going to be in the hands of the people who run our media companies themselves.
Well, Jeffrey Rosen, we really appreciate your insights in helping us unpack this and understand this urgent moment a little bit better. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.